Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us today here at the Jordan Centre and also to our audience online. Today we have Félix and Sophia Winkler, who are going to be presenting on Navigating Memory Wars, their research on Russian migrants in Germany and the Kremlin's digital influence. And I've got so many windows open on my laptop that I just lost their bios. So strong professional start from me. I'll just keep it short and sweet then. So Félix is a senior researcher now at ZOiS at the Centre for East European Studies in Berlin, and Sophia Winkler is a doctoral researcher also at ZOiS and is currently a visiting researcher here at our very own Jordan Centre. So rather than give a long introduction and take time away from your wonderful presentation, I will let you go ahead.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Emma, for sharing the talk this afternoon, and thanks everyone for coming. So what we are interested in for the next 1.5 hours or so is to look at the extent to which the Kremlin manages to impact on people with a Russian background, Russian descent, Russian speakers that live in Germany, especially how these people engage with history and the history offer that they can be exposed to. And for doing that, Sophia and I, we interviewed a number of people and exposed them to controversial history content that can be found on social media. And we're interested in understanding the reactions of these different people to the content that they might potentially see on social media. And so what we'll do now in the talk today is I'll briefly introduce you to kind of why history is interesting when one wants to understand Russia's reach into neighboring or further away countries via social media. We'll introduce the study that we did and then kind of give you some insights into the current state of the analysis and the way in which the Russian people that we've been interviewing and how they engage with the history that we selected for them. And for doing that, at the center of the research, there are 3 questions. The first one is, I said, well, there are contradictory interpretations of history. For us, they are contradictory. I think for many of us in the room, they're contradictory, but that might not be contradictory for people who encounter them on social media. So the first question is, well, do people actually realize that A and B are very different point of views on the same historical topic? Second question that we're interested in, well, and if they realize that these are contradictory, and even if they don't, what senses of belonging do people activate? So do they start to defend particular viewpoints? Do they start to engage at all? Do they activate family memories? Do they activate particularistic parts of their identity to justify or to dismiss a particular historical interpretation? And then we'll say more about that in a moment. We interviewed 2 generations of migrants in Germany, and so our question is, well, do those who were socialized in Russia differ from those individuals who were socialized in Germany? So first and second generation migrants, do they engage differently with historical content? But first, let's kind of back up a little bit. And the question of, well, why should we care about how the Russian language social media speaks about history? And for most of us in the room, I guess, those who follow Russian politics, it's a theme that we've witnessed over the last at least decade, and certainly since 2022, that the Russian president is a very big fan of history, historical analogies, keeps himself part of Stalin's library in his office, so there's a big devotion to using and abusing history. And we've seen, that's what I want to start, a couple of themes as being quite central in this use and abuse of history. It's something that started well before 2022. I think one of the decisive turning points here was 2019, actually, when we saw a very fundamental shift in how international history, especially in relation to the Second World War, is being portrayed. So 2019 was the 18th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on the 23rd of August 1939. And it's been traditionally in Soviet history been denied that secret protocol, which basically divided East Central Europe between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. The pact's existence has been admitted during Gorbachev's presidency, or when he was the leader of the head of the Communist Party. And then again, its existence has been denied. That changed in 2019 when Kremlin and the Kremlin itself started to push to frame that Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as basically having been a historical necessity. That this was a decision under these circumstances. It was a decision the Soviet Union took in order to protect other nations, that it was kind of forced into signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So we see since 2019 this reorientation of international history, and alongside of the last 10 years by now, we see that in the domestic sphere of Russia, more and more there's a control of what historical narratives circulate. So one of the turning points here is 2014, when the Penal Code was amended, adding an article that is, so to say, against the rehabilitation of Nazism. That's quite a drastic addition to the Penal Code, because for sentences that spread false information about the Soviet Union's activities during the Second World War, to quote that law, you can be fined with a fine of up to 500,000 rubles or up to 3 years in prison. And that law is not just kind of existing on a text, but it's actually being used. It's being used to punish not only political opponents, so Navalny himself was also accused based on that law, but you also have got various bloggers who find themselves usually paying fines, but as a symbol of the determination of the Kremlin to protect international and Russian versions of history, we sometimes also get private citizens who get punished. So there's a case of a student who spends 3 years in prison for urinating against the Red Army veterans' portrait whilst being drunk. So these are cases that obviously circulate in the Russian media, and it also demonstrates the commitment of the Kremlin to protect international, to protect its history. The 2020 constitutional amendment doesn't really change much, but it just puts it on a different level by making it part of the Constitution. There, the language in Article 67 is that the defenders of the fatherland are to be honored, and that the state has the responsibility to protect the historical truth. There are more laws that have followed since. Obviously, with the invasion of Ukraine, we see new additions to that, but it's going into that same direction of protecting one view of history. And at home, of course, you can do that with laws in quite a convenient way. One important element of that historical narrative that has developed in Russia is, of course, what to make with Ukraine. In the run-up to the full-scale invasion, really January, February, and in the weeks that followed the 24th of February, we see quite a number of arguments that always go into the same direction, questioning the very existence of Ukraine as a nation, going back to these mythical medieval times when apparently Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, they were all united. Putin can then all conveniently assert that we are all one historical people, and maybe kind of a natural choice, patriotism, that Ukraine should simply be part of Russia, and Belarus anyway should be treated the same way and simply be part of the Russian Federation. So we've got this going back to abstract medieval history, obviously not to understand the complicated, entangled history of East Central Europe, but simply to make present-day political claims, and at the same time invalidating everything that came after 1891. So the state borders that were agreed upon, the Bielavesh Accords, where the boundaries of 1991 were agreed upon by the 3 heads of state. So that's the quote that you can see at the bottom there. It was basically questioned, invalidated as state borders that one should still be following. You will be aware of that kind of as a, I think, almost next rhetorical step. What we can see in Putin's speeches is that those governing in Kiev, they were equated with Nazis. References to Bandera are quite frequently. And so the invasion of Ukraine itself was justified with references to the Great Patriotic War, of having to repeat the act of liberating Europe from fascism as it was done until the 9th of May 1945. So the invasion itself returned through that language of the Second World War in a mental map of the Great Patriotic War, and therefore necessity, something reasonable, and the right political choice, kind of historical mission of the Russian people. Yevgenia Albats already in 2022 herself made a very, I think, pertinent point that abuse of history of the Second World War, which is a very consensual theme for many Russians, might actually backfire. And that was still at the moment when she thought that there will be public visibility of the atrocities. Of course, you know that this has not gained any great public visibility, but it nevertheless shows that touching on the foundational story of the Russian state, given the atrocities that occur in Ukraine, might backfire, might invalidate the entire narrative of Russian statehood. The Russian state has also extended the narrative of it's not only the heroism and the kind of selfless liberation of Europe from fascism, but as a response partially also to being excluded from European memory initiatives, it has put the 27th of January more central, 27th of January, day of liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp by the Red Army, historical fact that is not particularly well known across most Western countries. And at the same time, the 27th of January was the day when the Leningrad blockade ended. So very conveniently, in that through that day, you can combine the narrative of suffering and heroism. And while the 27th of January did not play a greater role in the early 2000s in the Russian mnemonic calendar, it has become quite a central theme, because you can combine the greatest genocide in history, the Nazi genocide against the Jewish population of Europe, with one of the greatest war crimes of the Second World War, the Leningrad blockade. And so that in a way complements that historical picture that is being drawn on the Russian side in relation to the Second World War. And that is something that we were interested in, kind of how these, and we take two of those narratives only in our study, how these different narratives on the Second World War, how they are received among people who've left Russia and who might still be exposed to this kind of content. World War II is one of the kind of turning points, or one of the central points, of course, in the mnemonic calendar. Another one that we were interested in is how the annexation of Crimea was justified, because there's also a lot of history when it comes to explaining to the Russian population why that is a historically right step. And when you look at speeches and media coverage in relation to the annexation of Crimea, one language that I think most of you will have come across is this idea of a return, establishing historical justice, reunification of two bits that were separated in an unusual way. Putin would then praise Crimeans who've always been devoted and loyal to their fatherland, even though they were under control of Kiev, and then the annexation itself is seen as the step to liberating the population of Crimea, who then return after, quote, long, hard, and exhausting voyage. They return to their home port, to Russia. Third element, World War II, annexation of Crimea. And the third element that we were interested in is the role of Soviet nostalgia and references to the USSR's history. Elements of that, again, are probably known to most of you. Certainly that quote, Putin 2005, but it has been repeated a couple of times when he claimed that the Soviet breakdown was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. It's become a bit of a fixed expression nowadays that is being used regularly, but it echoes with the public sentiment that exists in Russia, where a stable, roughly 2/3 of the population would say they regret the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that is almost irrespective of which survey company you look at, be it Levada, when they still ask that question, but also the state-owned pollsters such as ZOiS would always find a very similar share. It's roughly 2/3 of the population. It's quite similar. And that nostalgia kind of links to people having positive assessments of social solidarity, of better friendship, better social relations, better childcare, better kind of neighborhood relations, which of course is true, but it also helps this reassessment of the Soviet era and the very negative views of the 1990s. And at the same time, it connects Putin's current mission to a feeling of what has been lost since the Soviet era. It creates historical continuities in a moment that maybe is very disruptive it's exploited as a political tool, and it is obviously a crucial element in the justification of Putin's regime, and something that we can also see circulate on social media, which is why it's our third theme that we are tapping into in our study.
Right.
Now with you.
Thank you. So we know that the Russian foreign policy includes several paragraphs that include historical goals and the need to protect Russia's historical significance in the world. It states, for example, that it wants to protect national interests in the following domains: to promote traditional Russian moral spiritual values, preserve cultural and historical heritage of the multi-ethnic people of the Russian Federation. And it wants to achieve the following goals: to enhance Russia's role in the global humanitarian space, consolidate the position of the Russian language in the world, and contribute to the preservation abroad of historical truth and the memory of Russia's role in the history. So another very often occurring kind of theme or strategy in the foreign policy is the Russian so-called compatriots. For example, those living outside of Russia should have their Russian identity protected by the Russian kind of soft power institutions. And it's an explicit foreign policy goal that is actually to mobilize Russian speakers as well as those who have also positive attitudes or feel positively towards the Russian Federation, who are, as they call it, loyal to the Russian Federation, to mobilize those to influence societies and also politics abroad. And in the Cold War, this was already part to kind of mobilize diasporic networks, and then it got a bit forgotten in after 1991, but has been picked up again now as a assertive kind of foreign policy instrument. And kind of actors who play a role in distributing this foreign policy through compatriots are, for example, the Ruski Mir Foundation, which many of you might know, who actually are kind of an extended arm of kind of the state's acts towards those living abroad. And of course, kind of the people that we're looking at, the first and second generation migrants who have still ties to Russia, are very appealing as they are still less integrated perhaps in the host societies in the countries where they migrated towards, and where there might still be an option to kind of create emotional as well as also linguistic link with their family's homeland or with their family history through, for example, social media. And this is where kind of the social media aspect comes in that we're looking at. We know that news and narratives today are increasingly shaped by the digital platforms. And on social media, particularly, people find themselves often in filter bubbles. So these are spaces where they mostly encounter opinions that kind of match their own. And usually or oftenly, these filter bubbles, they reflect also national borders. Or so to say, like kind of social or political dynamics or viewpoints or local politics. But they can also cut across borders, as we know. And this is particularly relevant for people who have a migratory background, who have a kind of second affiliation or another kind of particular interest. And for those users, social media can actually create a kind of a sense of meaning and belonging that is tied not just to one place, but tied to kind of the whole self that is kind of spread out or might also be hybrid. And of course, authoritarian states like Russia have recognized this power and have actually started to actively engage their diaspora communities online. So what does that actually mean when we talk about this kind of digital influence? There's this term also coming up in research a lot that speaks about the digital homeland. We know that this diaspora, they become a kind of a political actor. So they have this connection to the homeland online across the borders, but they might not even have been to the country or might have not been there for a long time, or they might have left it and not know anymore what it looks like. And then kind of the perception of homeland becomes, or the experience of homeland becomes completely an online experience, one that is not really tied to physical kind of experiences, but only a digital one. By kind of encountering these digital homelands, people can also then engage in advocacy or lobbying towards this homeland. For example, they might support foreign or internal politics in the host country. They might also engage in homeland politics. So in our sense, that would be Russian politics by supporting or opposing the regime. And they might also kind of engage in narrative shaping. So actively kind of offering either counter histories or kind of creating alternative public spaces to the ones that they know in their host country. And at the same time, this kind of emotional and cultural and political tie that is maintained contributes to the identity shaping and negotiation of the self in context also with the host country. And then depending on their own personal experiences as well as on their political leanings, they can respond in various ways to the strategies of their homeland, and they can also aim to influence, or reject or contest the narratives, or on the other way around, just very actively kind of apply them to themselves. And in that context, we say that the digital diaspora is actually battleground in memory wars. In another study, we have looked at what it actually means, this kind of offers of belonging between Germany and Russia on social media, and what role history plays in that. We know that some actors with these both ties promote more kind of a patriotic belonging. They draw on pride and moral superiority from the past, or others that also kind of draw on this imperial belonging. But I'm not going to talk about that too much now. If you want to chat about that, it's kind of a bit of another research. I'm happy to do so later. Yeah, so now we'll hand over to you.
Yeah, back to me. All right. Maybe was I think an important footnote, just to not exoticize what happens in Russia and what Russia tries to do with its compatriots, as they call it. It's certainly something that we've seen in several countries. Just to pick three that I think are important cases. One is China, where 2021, Xi Jinping was only the third leader of the Communist Party to pass a resolution that engages with history. The first one was the one from 1945 by Mao, and then 1981, the one by Deng. So this is laying out the Chinese version on history. It's where Xi defines his system as being Marxism of the 21st century and basically puts him on the same level as Mao and Deng. So one of the key leaders that define what China is. Big difference between China and Russia being that in the Chinese case, it's the party that is put as the supreme guide and the embodiment of the historical mission. And it's not the person of Xi himself, although there's obviously a lot of personality cult happening, but still, it's the party that is put first. But the point that we want to make is this importance of history and maintaining control over what historical narrative circulates at home, but then China also tries to reach its diaspora via digital means in a very sophisticated way. You also see that in Turkey, especially around 2023, when we had the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the modern Turkish Republic, where Erdogan himself put himself in the continuity of that line. And he himself was reviving the strongman of Turkish history, and has a resurrection of neo-Ottomanism in his own ideological outlook. And then, of course, if we look closer to where we are at the moment, also the current US administration keeps a very close eye on what history is being told and what history circulates in the country. It was last week on Thursday when this executive order was signed on restoring truth and sanity to American history, which currently targets the Smithsonian Institute that is accused of having spread divisive and race-centered ideology. And at the same time, we see orders of critically examining which statues have been taken down since 2021. So this concentration with history is not necessarily tied to the Russian version of autocracy, but it's also something that can come in different shapes of autocratic states as well as democracy. So I think it's just a word of, yeah, it's not that Russia is somehow odd in using history, but it's a very convenient resource for all kind of regimes, and it's a big part of 19th century nation building and democratization process. So it's not to excuse anything of what's happening, but it's also not that unusual. Okay, so here we are coming on with our study. What did we actually do? So we interviewed in total 40 people, focuses on young people living in Germany, young defined as 18 to 36, 20 of what we call Generation 1. So these are people who were socialized, finished their secondary socialization in Russia. And the sample is roughly composed of, well, that's actually strict, half left Russia after February 2022, half of them left before 2022. They've got a diverse attitudes on the 1990s. It's being something that brought more good and it brought more bad to the Russian Federation. We try to achieve socioeconomic diversity, but that's more difficult among those who've left more recently. And they're fairly balanced when it comes to male and female respondents. So that's the first generation, and then we have the second generation, is already alluded to at the very start, people who grew up in Germany, but who've got one parent who, him or herself, was socialized in Russia, or if that parent was not socialized in Russia, then the second generation respondents in the pre-screening survey expressed kind of a feeling of being associated to present-day Russia, and that's important in the German context because there's there are Russian speakers from countries such as Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, which have very close connections and share some of the political views that come from Moscow. So it's not as strictly tied to present-day borders of the Russian Federation. That's why here for that study, we also went kind of geographically slightly larger than just focusing on what is contained within present-day Russian borders. Then we had interviews of roughly 60 minutes with each of them, going through a variety of questions. First block on their political and social attitudes, kind of have a bit of a matrix of where these people stand in terms of social norms were about roles of men and women, political attitudes were about freedom for minorities, freedom of speech. Then we talked about kind of history in general, what they think matters, what parts of history matter to understand today's Germany and today's Russia. Again, to kind of do this mapping exercise of where people stand, what they know, and then we exposed them to a set of contradictory videos, short films on the three topics that we introduced at the start. So the annexation of Crimea. So one video emphasized this complex, entangled history of Crimea versus that story of Khrushchev just having handed it over on the whim to Ukraine. Then coverage of kind of the ordinary life in the Soviet Union, one glorifying female achievements and female workers on construction sites, and at the same time being just in perfect physical conditions, and contrasting that with shortages and queuing and the kind of day-to-day hardships of living through the Soviet Union. And then a third topos that we're looking at is World War II, with on the one hand kind of a very patriotic framing of the May 9th celebrations, where we end with the person doing the footage showing NATO tanks and military equipment that the Russian army captured in Ukraine, bringing the May 9th narrative to present-day war. Heavily patriotic, versus a video where the witness talks about the violence of the Red Army in Ukraine on its march to Berlin. So there's a deeply contradictory, opposing ways of putting an emphasis on the history. And then to finish, we're also interested in whether or not people engage with this kind of content on social media. If they encounter it, what do they do? Have to do a recipient study. Okay, so to give you a brief idea of what the politics look like in our sample, I want to focus briefly on the second generation, because I think that's where there's most nuance and diversity in what we are finding. So on the one hand, among those who were socialized in Germany, we find people very heavily imprinted by that German identity that they were exposed to in school. That's usually families that were not very committed or engaged in transmitting much about history to their children. So here's where we see that the school has quite some significance and manages to create a sense of belonging, because the family leaves that as a void. So they react very differently to the video material as well. Most respondents in that group would have fairly progressive values when it comes to the role of men and women at home, minority rights. They kind of engage with history mostly through kind of an institutional lens. So what did I learn at home, at school? What is the kind of the vision on history that I encountered in documentaries or in textbooks? They try to recall the historical knowledge. We've got kind of that progressive dimension among those with a German identity, and then a much smaller group that has more conservative viewpoints, and to some extent would echo or at least be sympathetic to some of the Kremlin narratives, but it's a much smaller group. Then we also managed to have the set of people on the top right in our sample, which are usually very hard to study, the very hard to study group, those who openly express a prevalent Russian identity after having been socialized in Germany. These are people who express kind of what one can, without any hesitation, call hardline nationalist perspectives on history and politics. Very open, pro-Kremlin, pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian, very likely also to be deeply embedded in conspirational networks, and people also who don't hesitate to bring up conspirational worldviews in an interview with one of us. Third group, bottom left, the hybrid identity, that's probably the biggest one in the second generation sample that we're having. So people who are attached to kind of their family roots of some mythical kind of, I was often in Russia as a child and my grandma still lives in the village and there's something inherently good about it. These are people who tend to be open to some of the narratives that, of the suggestions we see in the videos that we show them. So they would emphasize certain kind of conservative values and as I said, be open to them. And at the same time, they obviously grew up in Germany. They're therefore also more likely to have a critical stance towards that. Really emphasize. Then the way out here is, well, history is always context dependent and it's multi-perspective, but they are less likely to have a very clear judgment on what we are seeing. And then the last group that we classify as post-national identity is actually a very small one in our sample. Are people who just kind of are so beyond any national markers of identity that they're very much at ease navigating these different contradictory histories, and they've encountered all of them in their own family, but are not emotionally attached to any of the two versions that we are exposing them. So they are usually better educated, mostly highly progressive in their political views as well, and they don't feel like they have to defend either of the historical versions that we're showing. So let's move into findings now. So you can see two of the screenshots of the films that we're showing them to them. So on the left-hand side, you see this short extract of the very patriotic May 9th framing that I mentioned, and then on the right-hand side, that's the style of that short video about the Red Army's violence on the march to Berlin. What is interesting is that respondents did not necessarily see these two videos as being irreconcilable with one another. So, but quite a few who would say, yes, the first one is very convincing and the second one as well. Not those with a strong Russian identity. Obviously, they would find ways around explaining to us why that second video with civilian violence by the Red Army is totally wrong and is fabricated, and only the first one is the right way to look at history. But that's, of course, a rather extreme case. But for many of those in the second generation, the two versions seem equally, even appropriate to talk about history. So to give you just some feelings for how people talk about this. So in this hybrid identity group, the bottom left one that I quickly talked about, you've got a 22-year-old female participant in the interview. I don't think we should celebrate an achievement. If anything, it should be a day of remembrance and not a day of victory. I find that super cruel. I found this woman incredibly funny that she affirmed such a cruel day as super great. So you've got one who, okay, rejects that heroic and propagandistic description of the Second World War, and who does not buy with that, based on that hybrid identity that characterizes her into that May 9th celebratory victory narrative. Then on the other hand, someone who was also very deeply, also personalizing that idea of hybridity in her entire way of living, was very much taken by that second video. So it doesn't come across as nicely in the English as it actually does in the original. But I was really shocked about that second video. Expressing a sense of, well, we were all one people at that time, and then that knowing about that killing is something that shocked her in such a blatant way, and she found that convincing. Well, we asked them to rank it, so she gave it 10 out of 10. And it clearly kind of got her identity questioned, how the Russian army could have potentially done, the Red Army, and she referred to that as the Russian army, how they could have done that to the civilian population. Okay, and then here comes the other extreme, that Russian identity that I mentioned. By introducing that case, you've got one of the respondents. These are all pseudonyms.
One second, I think. Change the battery. I'll just stop for 1 second. Should be all good now.
All right. Okay. Okay, so that's the Victor case, who uses also throughout the entire interview. I mean, that's just as usual, just a very short snippet, but fascist-leaning terminology. We've got a similarly devoted participant. Let's call her Mira, similar generation, similar age. Well, you can see her response on the screen. Look, there's an audience of millions and all the weapons and the whole atmosphere, and you should never forget the day and always honor and remember it. That's very important. So Russia did most of it, so that's why they deserve the credit, in my opinion. Then she goes on about how much she dreams about being very soon in Moscow and celebrate the 9th of May. So first video, that line of continuity as well, that's what she puts the emphasis on between May 9th and the current war in Ukraine. And again, these are people who grew up in Germany, and her family is from Moldova. Okay. So you can see the different kind of types of engagements. The one that we call emotional patriotic. So one is this affirmative engagement, the Russian identities that you just saw on the previous slide with the quotes. And then, okay, this hybridity, maybe accepting both contradictory narratives, not merging them though. The one is acceptable and the other one is acceptable as well. The one relates maybe to a more family-based emotional memories, and the other one is a more kind of intellectual relationship to it. So the family emotional one is this May 9th, that is an important one to celebrate. And then there's the more intellectual engagement that, yes, potentially the violence was also part of it. but it is less immediate for the respondents, kind of separating emotionally those two worlds. The one is the authentic, that's me, that's my sense of belonging. The other one is more distant. And then a second kind of diametrically opposed engagement to the one that we just saw, the patriotic affirmative, is this what we call critical civic. So on the one hand, those who are morally motivated, people who are often classified as in this progressive German identity of post-national, some in the hybrid. These are people who would recognize the contradictions, find them irreconcilable, and would, with a kind of moral critique, respond to that first video glorifying the May 9th, and in particular on the continuity to the war in Ukraine. And people who kind of are clearly challenged in their belonging to Russia in that moment. And then there are those who have this intellectual distance to it. Kind of, they would almost respond like scholars, kind of, yes, emphasizing maybe a rational engagement with those contradictory ways of looking at history. They would speak about it in the third person, and kind of that's where we can sense that, yeah, there's not a deeper sense of belonging when it comes to confronting World War II narratives to them. And with that, back to Sophia.
Right, yeah. So our next topic that we looked at together with the interviewees was the everyday life in the Soviet Union. Félix already briefly described what these videos were about. Just to recap, the first one was depicting it was a kind of a montage of a couple of pictures of women workers, and there was a lot of glittery effects and a lot of kind of music that would feel very engaging, telling about how strong these women were in the Soviet Union, how they were always well looking, but also earning really well on doing all this hard work. And then the other one was more about the scarcity and kind of the difficulties and hardship during the Soviet Union. Among the responses, we also got a lot of this kind of patriotic affirmative superiority that we also have seen in the Second World War, though it was not necessarily the same people who responded in that way. So there were different kind of reasons for people to feel effective towards these videos. But interestingly, these two depictions, they are also not perceived as contradictions by themselves. So it can be that there was kind of this kind of more propagandistic kind of presentation of the role of women in opposition to the scarcities. Doesn't really have to be in opposition. It can be both at the same time. But on the other hand, this whole gender topic polarized a lot kind of the sample. So there were very extreme responses towards this video on both ends, whereas the kind of more socioeconomic video is more a kind of distanced approach to it, which doesn't include that many emotions. So what have people answered as, for example, there is a kind of more progressive leaning, very young schoolgirl. She's still at school. She doesn't really connect to her kind of Russian family roots, but still she says, I never have heard anything about food rationing from my parents. So apparently this is also not a big topic for her. But I have to agree about the strong women. My grandma from both sides are very strong women. They have also achieved a lot, such strong work, and are role models for me. So the family still comes in here, although that is not part of kind of any political orientation. You can still feel kind of this familial identification, familial belonging in this response. And then we have another response, a person that we have coded as being post-national. So he doesn't really care about where he comes from, kind of his ethnic cultural identity does not play a big role for him. And he says, I don't know, that from my grandmother's stories, especially after the war, after the Second World War, women were, of course, involved almost everywhere because the men were simply dead or crippled. The way they portray it somehow with the photos on the building sites, I think it was a bit pathetic. So he rejects this narrative, although he does have this kind of family story. And that brings us to kind of two modes of engagement that we want to show you briefly. There's more to them, but this kind of gender and family kind of approach of how to deal with these topics. The one is kind of the gender affirmation, where belonging is actually kind of constructed through the admiration of these Soviet workers. And this is also closely linked to kind of inherited memory about the familial female heroism and their resilience that is being talked about in the families. And at the same time, there's this utter rejection of this narrative, particularly among German or more hybrid and post-national identities, where people actually say this is not feminist. They dismiss this idealized femininity under socialism and even name it as propagandistic. And kind of their assessment comes more from an institutional kind of value rather than a family memory, so to say. And then there's the other topic, which is more kind of the socioeconomic attachment. And here, very interestingly, we see that, as I already said, there's not a lot of emotional response to it. It's being assessed more neutral. It, though, gets connected a lot to kind of family stories. So yes, indeed, my family did have to wait in lines or something like that, but it doesn't trigger kind of this effective response as it did with the gender topics. And then also it relates sometimes to people talking about how their families actually behave today in today's economy and how they perceive their parents, reflecting on their experiences during the Soviet Union and how they actually navigate kind of capitalist system in Germany where they are based with their families. So yes, the third and last topic that we looked at, as Felix already said, is the Crimea video. Here, the first one is kind of a documentary style video clip. This young man explains why the Crimean Insula was actually historically righteous with Ukraine, and that's why the annexation was illegal. And then the opposite, we have this kind of podcast-like two guys talking about the Khrushchev simply giving it away as a present without legal kind of foundation and without having the right to do so. And very interestingly, among the second generation, we have a lot of kind of detachment, or even I would call it disinterest in the topic. So it's not a very salient topic. It is more politically assessed by the first generation than it is by the second one. And here's what a couple of examples what people have said. So here's Mark. I've already heard about it, but to be honest, I'm not really interested in the topic. So there you can really see the Crimea thing is not something that interests people of the second generation. And then we also have a more kind of hybrid response from Maria. And I generally don't like it when people say only one or the other. It was something that was done by both sides at the same time, or generally where all of people were involved, and I don't really like to commit myself and say, no, I like this more than the other, but I would just like to know what really happened. So there you can also see this undecidedness, like, okay, it's just overwhelming, there's just too much kind of, and it's hard to choose. Very interestingly, especially in this Crimea topic, the family also plays a very important role among the second generation. Because we have a lot of people who actually have families with ties to kind of the Russian and Ukrainian context, and who can hear kind of these contradictions or both sides within just one family, and these divided kind of loyalties, as we have called that. So there, this kind of conflictual family engagement also is reflected in this maybe hybrid engagement with this complex topic. And then at the same time, we also have a more reflective kind of family engagement where the complexity is embraced, but then also kind of an outsider perspective is taken without kind of emotional assessment of whom in the family to stay loyal to, but rather to kind of look at it, okay, but what's the international law? Let's analyze that from this perspective. Now, thinking again about all the three topics that we have shown you, that we have talked about, we see that kind of, especially for the Second World War and for the Soviet Union, a lot more salience among the second generation than for the annexation of Crimea. Among the first generation, the knowledge around Crimea is much higher, whereas the Second World War gets much lower salience. So there's much less extreme responses among the first generation towards the kind of more patriotic depiction, as well as the kind of very critical Red Army video. And then these two very categorical engagement modes that we have shown you, so kind of the very patriotic affirmative one, as well as this kind of critical rejection of the historical narratives, can be found as modes of engagement with all three historical topics, which is very interesting, but also differs between people. So the same G2 person would not necessarily respond everywhere with a kind of patriotic engagement, but it really depends on their kind of family stories or on their historical knowledge or political leanings, where they would turn to depending on the topic. The compartmentalization, so this kind of, well, this might be true and the other one as well, but I'm able to separate those and not feel any conflict within myself, is very common among the hybrid identities. So those who are also a bit undecided between their national kind of affiliations, but are not as far removed from national affiliations to be post-national, as we call them. And this can also be found not as strongly, but also among the G1, but it's really kind of a more something that we see among the second generations. And then I think maybe to start wrapping this up before handing over to Felix, I want to go back to the research questions that we've shown you in the beginning. Do people notice contradictions, interpretations of history, and how do they deal with them? So we actually see that among the second generation, a large share does not actually recognize contradictions as we might perceive them as such, but rather kind of tries to not merge them, but kind of separate them emotionally and hand them kind of one at a time. However, when they're recognized, then they're either navigated by denial or kind of being relativized by kind of bringing in other kind of arguments that might still kind of oppose the viewpoint. And then to what senses of belonging to individuals drawn when they're confronted with conflicting historical narratives. This is very interesting, very depending on the historical topos. We have a very kind of national affiliation for the World War II. Also the family plays in there, but the family and kind of also more particularistic, as we've called it, regional or religious kind of focuses for the Soviet era. And for Crimea, it's really more this kind of detachment that we are seeing rather than any particular kind of performative belonging that we would see. And about the third research questions, though this is still under work, but so far we're concluding that we see a much clearer judgment among this first generation and the second generation, who is further detached from the homeland, so who is more kind of influenced by family and media in their perception of Russia, idealizes history more.
Then I'll not keep you long, but just a few final thoughts. What context will this all fit in? That's kind of a question that we are working on at the moment. And what we found striking when kind of going through this interview material now for the last couple of weeks really is how these multiple identities that people bring with them can be activated through such video material, and how especially when the family has not left a strong imprint on those individuals, how very contradictory information might be perceived as being true. So kind of what can the digital world actually make in terms of the historical national outlook of the consumers of such content? And I think especially as Sophia put it at the start, for people who are between different worlds, information that are perceived as potentially authentic coming from my historical homeland might actually have a very significant impact by activating senses of belonging, senses of nostalgia, and longing for an ideal past, which obviously was never as beautiful as it appears to be. I think the second kind of bigger thought that we have in our head at the moment is this entire literature on filter bubbles and how people kind of self-select through the algorithms into a curated feed on social media that always kind of delivers pleasurable content. And the question is, what happens if you disrupt that and expose people to information that they actually don't like? Does that change anything? Does that kind of has the power to lead to a shift, or does it rather reaffirm their convictions? And I think our research kind of speaks a little bit more to that. Well, it reaffirms their prior convictions anyway, because it's been extremely rare in the coverage that we showed to people that anyone felt challenged in their sense of belonging. The one person is the kind of quote that you saw on how shocked that individual was about the killings of the Red Army against civilians in Ukraine. But that's really, I mean, it's a remarkable example. It's a very emotional one. But on the top of my head, at least, it's also the only one. Usually the mode when you encounter something that you don't like is kind of you try to somehow dismiss it and put it aside, and then it wasn't real Russians, but probably people from Central Asia who did that killing. So it's fine. I'm still a good Russian, because also historically that's what fits. What we found both interesting in the responses is how much credit is given to the authenticity of material and what qualifies as authentic. So it wasn't rare to have respondents say, oh, this is AI generated, and none of that material was AI generated, but they're so alert to that, that sounds like an AI voice. On the other hand, okay, it's good that people are alert, but then they would dismiss the podcast, which clearly wasn't AI. These were two people who were kind of looking too genuine. But then they gave credit to films just because they had one source. And that one source you could obviously AI generate and make it look like a historical document. And sometimes that one document is what made people kind of side with, oh yeah, that short film was really convincing because they had historical photos from that era. And because that's the easiest to AI fabricate. So I think that's also something about when we think about platform regulation and what social media can do. And then the third bigger picture thought that we had is that it is this challenge for national educational systems of what to do in a migratory setting where the family has significant emotional impact on the teaching of history. It's the history that is authentic. It's your grandparents' history, your parents' history. It is something that is potentially mythical and links directly to who you are. And among those young people where the family was very invested in transmitting history, they also had the strongest reactions and the most kind of affirmative reactions to the patriotic versions of portraying that history. And it's that kind of sense of belonging that the family can create, which of course an educational system maybe doesn't want to create, but it creates a certain void. And I think the question here that emerges is, well, what do you do with this as a national education system? How do you engage the histories that migrants bring with them in order not to leave the emotionally charged history of the homeland entirely to the family with an unpredictable outcome, what it makes for their political leanings and political loyalties. And then kind of just to wrap it up, the research that Sophia and I were talking about is part of a kind of larger project. We're also doing surveys and focus groups. So if anyone is interested, that's the entire project that is in the background. Sophia is working on it. So am I. It ran since 2022. There's another 2.5 years to go. We look at Germany as one of the cases. And that's what you got today. We also study Canada and Estonia. The media analysis that you saw this afternoon. We also have a couple of surveys and focus groups running with those questions being at the center, transmission between generations, and to what extent migrant families differ in their transmission and in the sense of attachment to their homeland that develops among their people. So yeah, if you're interested in that, you can look that up on the webpage and obviously talk to us later as well. So then I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Felix and Sophia. I'm just going to come and sit at the front to manage the Q&A. So I'm going to kick us off with a question, and in the meantime, I encourage those of you in the room and also folks online to think if you have any questions. If you're joining us on Zoom, please write your question in the Zoom chat, and we will try our best to get back to it. I realised I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. I'm Emma Mateo. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at the Jordan Centre. I'm a political sociologist whose work focuses more on Ukraine. So this was really interesting and fascinating for me. I have a lot of questions, but I'm trying to think on what will be most interesting for the audience and the folks on Zoom. Could you tell us a little bit more about these kind of different identity types that you coded? I found them really interesting, but I was wondering if there were like really clear boundaries between the identity types, how you distinguish these, and also if certain identity types were more common in one generation versus the other. I think that I just find that really fascinating, like if you identified any clear differences between these two generations, or actually, you know, the commonalities are coalescing more around the identity types and so on.
You want me to?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So I think for the identity types, the way we approach it, and I think we have to say here, these are the identity types that we coded for the second generation. I'm not sure if we said that, maybe not, but yeah, this is only for the second generation. The first generation is not yet as clearly structured, but the way we went about it is we looked at kind of clear utterances in the kind of first part of the interview, where we speak about multiculturalism, where we speak about their values towards kind of how they view the role of men and women in Russia and in Germany, and then also after they explain to us which model they would prefer for themselves personally, and then also how they valued free speech and what kind of role they gave it. And we also dug deeper when we spoke to them about kind of potential, when we heard kind of potential Islamophobic or xenophobic kind of utterances. We also tried to dig deeper there, kind of where does it come from? Or the other hand, when people were like, very clearly like, okay, so my personal freedom ends where another person's freedom begins. So I think it was really kind of from that first part of the interview where we tried to kind of categorize them, and of course it's never as clear cut. I think this is very important to say. This is really kind of a first how to say to kind of to get us started on the analysis. I think that it is quite telling sometimes, and sometimes you can really see these kind of patterns very clearly in these persons. But whether someone is a little bit progressive or conservative might, for example, also differ in topics. So they might be very kind of hesitant towards multiculturalism, but very progressive, as we call it, when it comes to kind of equal rights between men and women. So yeah. So do you want to add something, or?
Maybe just one small thing. I mean, in some cases, it is actually extremely clear cut. I mean, people would present themselves in their kind of national identity. Be very clear about, you know,
easy for you.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about this Moldovan second generation girl who presented herself as very clear Russian. You know, I grew up in a Russian household. I'm proud to be Russian, and that's kind of where my political loyalties are. There are other extreme cases. We've got someone from the east of Ukraine who would constantly speak about me as part of a Christian Europe. And Germany is this embodiment of Christian Europe. And, you know, we need to defend those values. And that goes to what Sophia just said about then also using very Islamophobic language and that incompatibility between Islam and Christianity. But he was kind of leaves very little doubt about in which identity box he would fit quite, you know, without doing any injustice to him. Where it becomes more complicated is really the first generation. So
Sounds like you're still passing that out then.
I mean, the people who left, obviously, you can't just classify them as kind of Russian in a kind of intuitive way, because they left for not always political reasons, but a good share of them did. Still, what we find in response to these kind of very important historical turning points is that we also find a sense of belonging to Russia when it comes to speaking about the Second World War.
Yeah.
And the importance of, yes, we have that. I would like to continue commemorating my grandparents, great-grandparents' contribution to the victory over fascism. So there's a sense of commitment to a deeper Russian culture. You also have the other extreme, people who immediately, get almost angry when we show them that first video glorifying the May 9th parade. Okay, so clearly here's emancipation and distance taking. But I think there are these two extremes certainly that we encounter quickly among the first generation, but kind of defining more the shades of gray that we have among those who recently left. I think that's maybe also a bit more, there's maybe more overlap than among the second generation, which positions itself, maybe also because they're more exposed to that through that kind of transcultural discourse in which they are. There's a heightened awareness of who they are. And my sense is among those who left, the relationship to Russia is troubled, but what has replaced that sense of belonging is not yet maybe also clear for people. And that's, I think, what we encounter in the videos as well. They are navigating, to some extent searching, even in the interview, of what to make of their cultural background and the family relationships and the relationships to what they learned in school, and so on.
It's really interesting. It sounds like there's maybe a bit more diversity of experience amongst this generation that's been socialized in Germany, whereas the ones who have left more recently, they at least have more of the commonality of this common leaving and probably some sort of motivations to do with that. I found this finding that the kind of approach differs depending on the historical topic really interesting. I think I'm not a specialist on historical disinformation or historical narratives, but that seems really interesting to me, that actually it depends a lot on the aspect of history you're talking about, and the reactions can be really different depending on that. So I think this is really interesting research, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of it. I could ask more questions, but I want to give a chance first to folks in the room. Does anyone here have a question? Okay, a lot of questions, so we'll go. Maybe we're running till 4:30, right, Sasha?
Yeah.
So maybe if we collect the 3 questions in the room, does that sound okay to you? Because there's a couple on here as well, and then I'll let you answer. So if we're going around.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I have also many questions I could ask, but one that I'm quite interested in is if you could talk a little bit more about the specific backgrounds of the people that you were talking about in terms of ethnicity. And I mean, of course, it's very complex, but it is my understanding that in Germany, many people who emigrated from the former Soviet Union, often they get kind of all thrown under this umbrella of Russian, but there's actually much more heterogeneous identities, and particularly many ethnic Germans who are often framed as Russians, but are ethnic Germans who came from various parts of the former Soviet Union, who repatriated as Spätaussiedler to Germany. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about this, how some of the, I wonder whether, for example, ethnic Germans who migrated back to Germany with their families, whether they're maybe distancing themselves a bit from a certain Russian identity and how that plays out in their family. If you could just offer a little bit more information about those things, that'd be very interesting.
Then did you have a question, Sasha?
Yeah, I missed the first few minutes, so I have a few questions. Maybe these first few questions were covered in the time that I missed, but I was just curious if you guys could talk a little bit more about how you recruited people, like how people found the study, how people came to you, and then maybe just speak a little bit more about why you were focused on this age group. And also I was curious if you asked people any questions more generally about their social media use, and how responses differed or didn't based on the frequency of use of social media and what types of social media people use and things like this, because it seems to me that the sort of counterintuitive point that you brought up at the end, or not counterintuitive, but the point that you brought up at the end about people being only further not radicalized, but the contradictory views having no impact on not changing people's mind, that might in some ways be a product of people using social media more or less often. Sorry if that doesn't make sense. Yeah, that was my question.
Maybe we'll go with those two questions to start with, because I feel there was a lot to unpack there, and then we'll come back to the.
Okay.
Do you want to take the message question?
I can take the ethnicity question. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you very much for asking that question. So we actually have got quite a nice bouquet of ethnicities, because you're right. There's a lot of heterogeneity in Germany. So we've got that comes particularly strong in responses to the Soviet videos and those covering the Second World War, because people would bring up their, for instance, Jewish background there,
Right.
and okay, what that implies, having been or being part descendant of a Jewish family that lived through the Great Patriotic War, and in a particular position during the Soviet era. So there were a number of respondents, also Jewish aristocratic background and their own deportations. So we get into these people, and I kind of link the Chechen respondents that we have as well to that, because in both cases, what we find is that the responses are much less linked to a national narrative of belonging, but this kind of framing as the Great Patriotic War, as that great Russian deed, the service of the Soviet Union as being nowadays only Russia in that memory narrative. That is something that really doesn't travel to people who've got a strong particularistic identity, either Jew or Chechen. When it comes to those with a Russian-German background, we actually don't find more distance to that Russian narrative. If anything, the one respondent whom I cited already, this Viktor, he's one of those Russian Germans from Kazakhstan and extremely loyal to the Kremlin's view. We have a couple of other people who frame themselves as Spätaussiedler, because it's also a fluid category, right? It's not like unambiguous given the complicated 2 centuries of history that are behind them. But that one person who introduces herself as being a Spätaussiedler, she will also reiterate extremely conservative viewpoints in all these political questions and be very alarmist about the decay of German moral norms, of societal safety, of democratic standards. So you can sense there a certain impact of disinformation campaigns, proximity maybe to some elements that AfD narratives could quite easily pick up. So it's not the case that across the board these people are more distant. I think the distance really comes from kind of a more intellectualized engagement and the success of the school. And the German school manages to imprint its sense of belonging and civic duty and citizenship education when that works. Then we see the kind of more intellectual engagement, but that does not correlate in qualitative studies, maybe not the right term, but it doesn't rhyme with having that Russian-German status.
Thank you.
Maybe to add to that, what it also links to your question. What we did in the beginning, before the interviews, we sent out a survey where people actually also indicated beyond their social media use, which I will respond to in a minute. We also asked them to describe their ethnic cultural background. And for example, then we would also know what background they have, but we had a person who kind of described herself as Russian, and then only during the interview, it became clear that she had a Russian-German mother. So she was ethnically kind of German, as we would put it, but she hadn't indicated that in the survey. So then we also wouldn't know necessarily. And maybe to say again, from our recruiting criteria, right, for the kind of the first generation, it was to be socialized, to have been socialized in today's Russian Federation. So then the ethnicity doesn't really play a role during the recruitment, but it's really kind of the territorial borders of where we are recruiting people from. And for the second generation, it was this kind of felt affiliation to Russia, to kind of do you feel close to the Russian Federation today. And there again, that's why, for example, we also have someone from Moldova or someone from Kazakhstan. Yeah, maybe just to clarify that as well. For us, it was really kind of centering also about this kind of Russian language, right? That is kind of inherent in this kind of also kind of foreign policy strategy. And then on your questions of the social media use, should I try them? Yeah. So there we know what platforms people use. We know what they consult, what kind of accounts they like to consult to inform themselves about Germany and Russia. And we know how active or not active they post. So we all asked that in the survey. And then we also asked what topics they're interested in and what topics they're avoiding. And that's how we also then kind of knew whether a person would be politically interested or not. And then we kind of also selected them into our sample a bit from kind of this pre-screener, so to say. And when we speak to them about the content, we'd ask them, have you ever encountered something like this in your social media kind of experience? How do you deal with it when you see it? Do you dismiss it? Do you engage with it? How would you react to that if you actually would see this kind of content? About the age group, it links to social media. It's because these are the people actually active on social media and active on the platforms that we are studying. So we are looking at kind of, or we drew content from TikTok and YouTube. And I think these are kind of the classical platforms that this group is using. And the frequency, I mean, we know whether they actively post or just passively consume, that we know. We don't know whether they're influencers, for example, that we can tell, but yeah. Yeah, do you want to add?
Maybe just one small thing, because we also then always ask kind of how would you engage with this kind of content on social media, and what's maybe a bit sad, I have to say, is the more reasonable responses. The respondents were very reflective in how they engaged with that content. They were the first to say, well, I've completely disengaged. Like, I would not go out there. I would watch the material. I would not even like it, because I don't want the people that I'm befriended with to even be aware that I've consumed that content. And the few people who were kind of a bit militant about getting involved and getting into these fights on the different platforms, they were also the ones who had the most pronounced views on social media. So it leaves a bit of a bad feeling as to the style of engagement, of course, that emerges on social media. But yeah, there's this sense of kind of it's better to just keep silent, to silence yourself, and to not take the risk putting something out there which is linked to your own identity. It's left to those who are ready to put in the emotional involvement to fight that fight. But that was extremely rare in our group. Most of them mentioned, it pops up every now and then. And I very likely consume content in German and Russian. For the first generation, of course, primarily in Russian, but in the second generation mixed. So it's kind of authentic content in the sense that we obviously don't know if that is part of the kind of Russian information strategy. That this material circulates when your algorithm is set to be between these two worlds. You're likely to encounter historical material in the flavor that we've shown people. And some people recognized some of the footage that we showed. They were like, yeah, I've seen that person before. And I think that was kind of for us kind of a validity test that the material is not totally detached of how they engage with social media, but actually the kind of content that the algorithm feeds to them.
Great, thank you. So we have another question in the front row.
So thank you so much for the presentation. It's really, really interesting. So I'm just going to preface this with saying that I'm quite far away from my own research, so sorry for the ignorance. It was something that I thought about when listening to the presentation, which is like you are talking about how your different identities depending on like if you're second and first generation, how you might resolve these issues differently and so on. And I was also thinking about like to what extent does the actual country where these people move to and that country's specific current policies with respect to the war also influence these things. And this is like extremely anecdotal, and I'm from Sweden, just here visiting, but I was in Brighton Beach the other day, and from what I understand, they have like an important community that come from previous Soviet Union, and it's even called Little Odessa sometimes, from what I understand. And as I was walking there, I was remembering a news reportage that I saw in the beginning in Sweden from the war, where they were showing how people were coming together from like both people that identify as Russian and Ukrainian, like against the war, basically. And what I noticed there, which is maybe doesn't mean anything, is that I didn't see like any Ukrainian flags. So what I was like left wondering with is like, how do these people think now, like in general, versus how they thought 2 years ago or so. So like how do you also resolve it with respect to like what is accepted in the country where you're living, kind of, and the politics that they have. And super shortly, the very interesting with this observation of people thinking that it's AI generated content. That got me thinking of this notion of like the liar's dividend, basically like calling something which is correct as fake news might actually be like beneficial for you. And I was thinking about like if you actually could already see that in your data, that if the thing does not align with what you think, are you more likely to call it fake news? Because maybe it's not so much that you think that it's fake news, but it's just another way of like resolving it in a way. Yeah.
Interesting questions. I mean, I do, just as someone who's lived in New York for a few years, I do think there used to be more Ukrainian flags in Brighton Beach, but it's a really interesting question. And then we have James in the back, and then I'll just pick up one of the questions offline and I'll let you answer all together.
First, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm going to ask a question as a historian, and the question is about the nature of historical inquiry. We spend probably around close to a decade attempting to purge ourselves of this habit of reflecting something through our generation, through our national position, and we frankly still often fail to do it, right? So I'm thinking, do you think you might, do you plan to engage in the frankly enormous body of literature that historians have written on the problem of historical inquiry to begin? The classic, when I was in graduate school, was Peter Novick's That Noble Dream. And do you think that might to help you to understand amateur interpretations of history, such as those that you're drawing on through these interviews? And just a very quick comment. I'm actually very encouraged that people are skeptical of people see the things and they assume that it's AI and then they write it off. That's probably a good thing.
And then just a quick question from the Zoom chat from Victoria. Says, dear colleagues, I was wondering whether your research also touches on the positioning of Russia as the motherland within Russian propaganda rhetoric, particularly the way this concept assigns Russia as the mother of nations. Given the portrayal of Russia as female, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how this gendered symbolism is employed in shaping national identity. So a lot of juicy questions there for you to unpack, and we have just under 10 minutes, so to do your best.
Sure, yeah. I'll give you the historian question. Yeah, so I think I'll go ahead and try to pick up the policy question first, and then I'll be happy to also hear your thoughts on it, because I think you might have a different angle on this. So yeah, it's actually very interesting, right? I think it comes through when we kind of speak about kind of what makes up German identity, that this kind of state curated narrative from Germany also plays in within kind of this reception. And that this socialization, particularly among the second generation, does play a role, of course, because they've been going to schools in Germany. In terms of kind of the official state position, for example, towards Ukraine, I have to say, I think we haven't had that much. There was more talk, I think, not necessarily about kind of German foreign policy, but then it's more about kind of internal German phenomena that people have been talking about, if I remember correctly. So, for example, the far right-wing party and its role and kind of how far you're able to kind of engage with it. So that plays a role. Yeah, I guess Felix can add more to this. And I really like the idea of liars divided, and I think, so we are thinking of picking this up and talking in the next step a bit about kind of what drives trust within people. And I think this is a very interesting notion to think about it. How to what actually happens when you label something as fake news in the perception of people. So, yeah, do you want to add? And then
Sure. To your first question, I think the only thing I would like to add to what Sophia said is that among a non-negligible share of respondents, the way Germany has engaged with the Russian invasion of Ukraine has strengthened people's skepticism of the German media landscape. So I found that was really a strong moment in an interview when someone said, well, my father only consumes official state media, so he's so biased when it comes to the war on Ukraine. I can't talk to him anymore. That was from someone who has a mother who's from Belarus, and who otherwise has also a critical mindset on, he's very deeply in the partisan memory of his great grandparental generation, and he does not endorse that hoorah patriotism that comes from Russia, but his father only consuming state media, which the conventional German media that many people consume, that for him kind of made it almost impossible to have a dialogue about political topics. And I think that's kind of that loss of credibility is something that we encounter across a couple of interviews. So speaking to this, the current context in Germany. And that goes deeper for, here it's very politicized. We also have it in other shapes of not giving any voice in the point of view of these interviewees, not giving voice to the AfD, for instance. And then that kind of kicks in with free speech debates. So why are they not allowed to speak? And there's no diversity of opinions and so on. So yes, that is something that we do see quite strongly. And dismissing SAI to navigate contradictions. I'm not sure it's that systematic that people do it to only dismiss content they don't like, but we need to maybe systematically kind of go through this. And then to the question of the historical literature. So we are coming to that primarily from this memory studies angle, to look at how history is being appropriated kind of on the individual level, and what collective frames of remembrance are activated when people kind of engage on an individual level with broader societal narratives about history. So that slots into the kind of Halbwachs literature on Durkheim, Halbwachs memory studies. I think that's where we are trying to kind of root that conceptually a little bit more. What you suggest absolutely reasonable. All right, one could go that way, but I think just the way the study has been designed, I think that's why it speaks a little bit more naturally too, and also because that's the usage that we certainly see being made from history from the Russian side is very much speaking to that. It's not an amateur interpretation of history, but it's this very strong instrumentalization of history, and reframing the memory narratives through the laws that I talked about at the beginning, or simply through pushing with the institutional power that you have as a state, pushing narratives through a diversity of actors. And then Victoria's question, I think Russia as a motherland does not kind of this female symbolism. I don't recall any single interview where that came up from respondents. That idea is not something that seems to have traveled into at least the group that we interviewed, but maybe you've got a different recall.
I also don't recall that it being mentioned, and we asked people how is Russia portrayed in these videos and how do you feel about that. So we do engage in this. That's why, I think this is not a concept that seems to be on people's kind of top of their minds, coming up naturally. So no, but it's an interesting thought, definitely.
So I'll finish by paraphrasing quickly a question from Anna Samodova in the chat, which I think is interesting. She's asking about some of the practical applications of your research. So maybe you have an idea of what lessons could be taken away regarding how digital platforms can perhaps challenge Kremlin narratives and support civic engagement across different generations.
Very interesting.
That's a good last question, right?
Yeah, it's Yeah, it's definitely a very topical question, and one that is not easy to answer in times where platforms are moving away from any regulations and on the other hand, not allowing kind of any restrictions in terms of what is going on the platforms, right? So I think, but one thing that we know from kind of other research in more kind of communication sciences that is working well to avoid people falling for disinformation is this pre-bunking. So this actually kind of, it's like a vaccine where you kind of inform people about the goal beforehand, before they encounter this kind of content. The problem is there's already so much kind of content out there that this concept is very hard to grasp right now. And I think one of the challenges that will remain is how do we actually engage with people who are already so deep in this kind of filter bubble that anything that comes from kind of so this is kind of, sometimes this is very closely tied to also conspiracy kind of networks or kind of this right-wing media outlets, and people would, for example, on what topics do you avoid, people would just say like state media, for example. And then it's really hard because how do you reach people who are already so far in filter bubbles? I think this is something that will continue to keep us awake at night, or and it's definitely not something that I could now solve from the top of my head. There's a solution for
I also
that.
won't solve that on the top of my head now, but I think, I mean, what you put very, very nicely is, I mean, to a large extent, this is beyond the platforms, right? It comes, it's prior to people encountering this material on social media, because those people who were more open to multi-perspective interpretations of history in our study, they were also the ones who were maybe more likely to be challenged in that sense of belonging, who were taken by the videos, and they were ready to kind of entertain that multi-perspectivity. But that's something that you bring with to your day-to-day social media encounter, and that needs to be taught at school. So a lot of it is outside. I think one point that I find kind of connects a lot of the interviews is that people are aware of contradictions in how we think about history, and that attempt, which I think maybe it's also kind of an impetus in liberal democracies to, and certainly in autocracies as well, but to kind of play down the contradictions that are part of social problems does not travel well into society, because people have a desire for these contradictions and to be aware, to be exposed to them. And I think that is also in the interest for, if we think about the practical implications, how to stabilize democracy, is how do you engage with those contradictions rather than trying to push through one narrative. And we've got that in responses to the war in Ukraine, but also in response to what to do with Soviet history, what to do with World War II history, especially people who live between countries who've got that alleged authenticity from their homeland and the institutional knowledge in their country of residence. These contradictions, they need to be curated, and I think there needs to be a space for them. And I think that's, for me, certainly a practical implication, that this ought to be done. And there are ways of doing that, right? I mean, it's not like Russia and Germany is the first case where this question emerged. I mean, Northern Ireland has been going through that process, where Catholics and Protestants have been brought together in either schools or museums to engage in their very different views on the Irish history. We've got the same in France with colonial history. There are a couple of successful projects, Israel-Palestine. This kind of dialogue takes place, and I think especially for people with a migratory background, this is very important, because that authenticity that the homeland family brings by being transmitted through prior generations is something that an institutionally transmitted knowledge just can't compete with. That's where you need that authenticity of dialogue of witnesses or descendants. I think that's, for me, one of the practical implications of that research.
That's super interesting. Thank you both so much for sharing this research. And it sounds like there's a lot more to come, both on this paper and broader projects. So I encourage our audience to follow along. And of course, Sophia is a doctoral student, so this is the beginning of her career in research. So please join me in thanking very much our presenters.